Strange Highways. Chapter 1. On that autumn afternoon when he drove the rental car into Asherville, Joey Shannon broke out in an icy sweat. A sudden and intense hopelessness overcame him. He almost hung a hard U-turn in the middle of the street. He resisted the urge to jam the accelerator into the floorboards, speed away, and never look back. The town was as bleak as any in Pennsylvania coal country, where the mines had shut down and most good jobs had been lost decades ago. Nevertheless, it wasn't such a desperate place that the very sight of it should chill his heart and bring him instantly to the edge of despair. He was puzzled by his peculiar reaction to this long-delayed homecoming. Sustained by fewer than 1,000 local residents and perhaps 2,000 more in several smaller outlying towns, the commercial district was just 2 blocks long. The 2- and 3-story stone buildings erected in the 1850s and darkened by a century and a half of grime were pretty much as he remembered them from his youth. Evidently the Merchants Association or the town council was engaged in a beautification project. All the doors, the window frames, the shutters, and the eaves appeared to have been freshly painted. Within the past few years, circular holes had been cut out of the sidewalks to allow the planting of young maple trees that were now 8 feet tall and still lashed to support poles. The red and amber autumn foliage should have enlivened the town, but Asherville was grim, huddled, and forbidding on the brink of twilight. Balanced on the highest ridges of the western mountains, the sun seemed strangely shrunken, shedding light that didn't fully illuminate anything it touched. In the sour yellow glow, the rapidly lengthening shadows of the new trees reached like grasping hands onto the cracked blacktop. Joey adjusted the car heater. The greater rush of hot air did not immediately warm him. Above the spire of Our Lady of Sorrows, as the retiring sun began to cast off purple cloaks of twilight, an enormous black bird wheeled in circles through the sky. The winged creature might have been a dark angel seeking shelter in a sacred bower. A few people were on the streets, others in cars, but he didn't recognize any of them. He'd been gone a long time. Over the years, of course, people changed, moved away, died. When he turned onto the gravel driveway at the old house on the east edge of town, his fear deepened. The clapboard siding needed fresh paint, and the asphalt shingle roof could use repair. But the place wasn't ominous by any measure, not even as vaguely Gothic as the buildings in the heart of town. Modest, dreary, shabby. Nothing worse. He'd had a happy childhood there in spite of deprivation. As a kid, he hadn't even realized that his family was poor. That truth hadn't occurred to him until he went away to college and was able to look back on their life in Asherville from a distance. Yet for a few minutes, he waited in the driveway, overcome by inexplicable dread, unwilling to get out of the car and go inside. He switched off the engine and doused the headlights. Although the heater hadn't relieved his chill, he immediately grew even colder without the hot air from the vents. The house waited. Maybe he was afraid of facing up to his guilt and coming to terms with his grief. He hadn't been a good son. And now he would never have another opportunity to atone for all the pain that he had caused. Maybe he was frightened by the realization that he would have to live the rest of his life with the burden of what he'd done, with his remorse unexpressed, and forgiveness forever beyond reach. No, that was a fearful weight, but it wasn't what scared him. Neither guilt nor grief made his mouth go dry and his heart pound as he stared at the old homestead. Something else. In its wake, the recessional twilight drew in a breeze from the northeast. A row of 20-foot pines stood along the driveway, and their boughs began to stir with the onset of night. At first, Joey's mood seemed extraordinary, a portentous sense that he was on the brink of a supernatural encounter. It was akin to what he had sometimes felt as an altar boy a long time ago, when he'd stood at the priest's side and tried to sense the instant at which the ordinary wine in the chalice became the sacred blood of Christ. After a while, however, he decided that he was being foolish. His anxiety was as irrational as any child's apprehension over an imaginary troll lurking in the darkness under his bed. He got out of the car and went around to the back to retrieve his suitcase. As he unlocked the trunk, he suddenly had the crazy notion that something monstrous was waiting in there for him, and as the lid rose, his heart knocked explosively against his ribs. He actually stepped back in alarm. The trunk contained only his scuffed and scarred suitcase, of course. After taking a deep breath to steady his nerves, he withdrew the single piece of luggage and slammed the trunk lid. He needed a drink to settle his nerves. He always needed a drink. Whiskey was the only solution that he cared to apply to most problems. Sometimes it even worked. The front steps were sway-backed. The floorboards on the porch hadn't been painted in years, and they creaked and popped noisily under his feet. He wouldn't have been surprised if he had crashed through the rotting wood. The house had deteriorated in the 2 decades since he had last seen it, which surprised him. For the past 12 years, on the first of each month, his brother had sent a generous check to their father, enough to allow the old man either to afford a better house or to renovate this place. What had Dad been doing with the money? The key was under the rubber-backed hemp mat, where he'd been told that he would find it. Though Asherville might give him the heebie-jeebies, it was a town where a spare key could be kept in an obvious place, or a house could even be left unlocked with virtually no risk of burglary. The door opened directly into the living room. He put his bag at the foot of the stairs to the second floor. He switched on the lights. The sofa and the armchair recliner were not the same as those that had been there 20 years ago, but they were so similar as to be indistinguishable from the previous furniture. Nothing else appeared to have been changed at all, except the television, which was big enough to belong to God. The rest of the first floor was occupied by the combined kitchen and dining area. The green formica table with a wide chrome edge band was the one at which they had eaten meals throughout his childhood. The chairs were the same too, although the tie-on cushions had been changed. He had the curious feeling that the house had been untenanted for an age, sealed tomb-tight, and that he was the first in centuries to invade its silent spaces. His mother had been dead 16 years, his dad for only a day and a half, but both seemed to have been gone since time immemorial. In one corner of the kitchen was a cellar door, on which hung a gift calendar from the First National Bank. The picture for October showed a pile of orange pumpkins in a drift of leaves. One had been carved into a jack-o'-lantern. Joey went to the door, but didn't open it right away. He clearly remembered the cellar well. It was divided into 2 rooms, each with its own outside entrance. One contained the furnace and the hot water heater. The other had been his brother's room. For a while he stood with his hand on the old cast-iron knob. It was icy under his palm, and his body heat didn't warm it. The knob creaked softly when he finally turned it. 2 dim, dust-covered bare bulbs came on when he flicked the switch, one halfway down the cellar stairs, the second in the furnace room below, but neither chased off all the darkness. He didn't have to go into the cellar first thing at night. The morning would be soon enough. In fact, he could think of no reason why he had to go down there at all. The illuminated square of concrete floor at the foot of the steps was veined with cracks, just as he remembered it, and the surrounding shadows seemed to seep from those narrow fissures and rise along the walls. "Hello?" he called. He was surprised to hear himself speak, because he knew that he was alone in the house. Nevertheless, he waited for a response. None came. "Is someone there?" he asked. Nothing. At last he shut off the cellar lights and closed the door. He carried his suitcase to the second floor. A short, narrow hallway with badly worn gray and yellow flecked linoleum led from the head of the stairs to the bathroom at the back. Beyond the single door on the right was his parents' room. Actually, for 16 years since his mother's death, his dad had slept there alone. And now it was nobody's room. The single door on the left side of the hall was the door to his old bedroom, into which he had not set foot in 20 years. The flesh prickled on the nape of his neck, and he turned to look down the stairs into the living room, half expecting to discover that someone was ascending after him. But who might have been there? Everyone was gone. Dead and gone. The stairs were deserted. The house was so humble, small, narrow, plain. Yet at the moment it felt vast, a place of unexpected dimensions and hidden rooms where unknown lives were lived, where secret dramas unfolded. The silence was not an ordinary quiet, and it cut through him as a woman's scream might have done. He opened the door and went into his bedroom. Home again. He was scared, and he didn't know why. Or if he knew, the knowledge existed somewhere between instinct and recollection. Chapter 2. That night, an autumn storm moved in from the northwest, and all hope of stars was lost. Darkness congealed into clouds that pressed against the mountains and settled between the high slopes, until the heavens were devoid of light and as oppressive as a low vault of cold stone. When he had been a teenager, Joey Shannon had sometimes sat by the single window of his second-floor bedroom, gazing at the wedge of sky that the surrounding mountains permitted him. The stars and the brief transit of the moon across the gap between the ridges were a much-needed reminder that beyond Asherville, Pennsylvania, other worlds existed where possibilities were infinite, and where even a boy from a poor coal country family might change his luck and become anything that he wished to be, especially if he were a boy with big dreams and the passion to pursue them. This night, at the age of 40, Joey sat at the same window with the lights off, but the sight of stars was denied him. Instead, he had a bottle of Jack Daniels. 20 years ago, in another October when the world had been a far better place, he'd come home for one of his quick and frequent visits from Shippensburg State College, where, with the help of a partial scholarship, he had been paying his way by working evenings and weekends as a supermarket stock clerk. His mom had cooked his favorite dinner, meatloaf with tomato gravy, mashed potatoes, baked corn, and he had played some two-handed pinochle with his dad. His older brother, PJ, for Paul John, also had been home that weekend, so there had been a lot of laughter, affection, a comforting sense of family. Any time spent with PJ was always memorable. He was successful at everything that he tried, the valedictorian of his high school and college graduating classes, a football hero, a shrewd poker player who seldom lost, a guy at whom all the prettiest girls looked with doe-eyed interest. But the best thing about him was his singular way with people and the upbeat atmosphere that he created wherever he went. PJ had a natural gift for friendship, a sincere liking for most people, and an uncanny empathy that made it possible for him to understand what made a person tick virtually upon meeting him. Routinely and without apparent effort, PJ became the center of any social circle that he entered. Highly intelligent yet self-effacing, handsome yet free of vanity, acerbically witty but never mean, PJ had been a terrific big brother when they had been growing up. More than that, he'd been, and after all these years still was, the standard by which Joey Shannon measured himself, the one person into whom he would have remade himself if that had been possible. In the decades since, he had fallen far short of that standard. Although PJ moved from success to success, Joey had an unerring knack for failure. Now he took a few ice cubes from the bowl on the floor beside his straight-back chair and dropped them into his glass. He added 2 inches of Jack Daniels. One thing that Joey hadn't failed at was drinking. Although his bank account had seldom been above $2,000 in his entire adult life, he always managed to afford the best blended whiskey. No one could say that Joey Shannon was a cheap drunk. On the most recent night that he'd spent at home, Saturday, October 25th, 1975, he had sat at this window with a bottle of RC Cola in his hand. He hadn't been a boozer back then. Diamond-bright stars had adorned the sky, and there had seemed to be an infinite number of possible lives waiting for him beyond the mountains. Now he had the whiskey. He was grateful for it. It was October 21st, 1995, another Saturday. Saturday was always the worst night of the week for him, although he didn't know why. Maybe he disliked Saturday because most people dressed up to go out to dinner or dancing or to a show to celebrate the passage of another work week, while Joey found nothing to celebrate about, having endured another 7 days in the prison that was his life. Shortly before 11 o'clock, the storm broke. Brilliant chains of molten silver lightning flashed and rattled across the wedge of sky, providing him with flickering, unwanted reflections of himself in the window. Rolling thunder shook the first fat raindrops from the clouds. They snapped and spattered against the glass, and the ghostly image of Joey's face dissolved before him. 1:30 midnight, he rose from the chair and went to the bed. The room was as black as a coal mine, but even after 20 years he could find his way around without light. In his mind's eye he held a detailed image of the worn and cracked linoleum floor, the oval-shaped rag rug that his mother had made, the narrow bed with simple painted iron headboard, the single nightstand with warped drawers. In one corner was the heavily scarred desk at which he had done his homework through 12 years of school, and when he was 8 or 9 had written his first stories about magical kingdoms and monsters and trips to the moon. As a boy, he had loved books and had wanted to grow up to be a writer. That was one of the few things at which he hadn't failed in the past 20 years, though only because he had never tried. After that October weekend in 1975, he'd broken his long habit of writing stories and abandoned his dream. The bed was no longer covered by a chenille spread as it had been in those days, and in fact it wasn't even fitted with sheets. Joey was too tired and fuzzy-headed to bother searching for linens. He stretched out on his back on the bare mattress, still wearing his shirt and jeans, not bothering to kick off his shoes. The soft twang of the weak springs was a familiar sound in the darkness. In spite of his weariness, Joey didn't want to sleep. Half a bottle of Jack Daniels had failed to quiet his nerves or to diminish his apprehension. He felt vulnerable. Asleep, he'd be defenseless. Nevertheless, he had to try to get some rest. In little more than 12 hours, he would bury his dad, and he needed to build up strength for the funeral, which wasn't going to be easy on him. He carried the straight-back chair to the hall door, tilted and wedged it under the knob, a simple but effective barricade. His room was on the second floor. No intruder could easily reach the window from outside. Besides, it was locked. Now, even if he was sound asleep, no one could get into the room without making enough noise to alert him. No one. Nothing. In bed again, he listened for a while to the relentless roar of the rain on the roof. If someone was prowling the house at that very moment, Joey couldn't have heard him, for the gray noise of the storm provided perfect cover. "Shannon," he mumbled, "you're getting weird in middle age." Like the solemn drums of a funeral cortege, the rain marked Joey's procession into deeper darkness. In his dream, he shared his bed with a dead woman who wore a strange, transparent garment smeared with blood. Though lifeless, she suddenly became animated by demonic energy, and she pressed one pale hand to his face. "Do you want to make love to me?" she asked. "No one will ever know. Even I couldn't be a witness against you. I'm not just dead, but blind." Then she turned her face toward him, and he saw that her eyes were gone. In her empty sockets was the deepest darkness he had ever known. "I'm yours, Joey. I'm all yours." He woke not with a scream, but with a cry of sheer misery. He sat on the edge of the bed, his face in his hands, sobbing softly. Even dizzy and half nauseated from too much booze, he knew that his reaction to the nightmare was peculiar. Although his heart raced with fear, his grief was greater than his terror. Yet the dead woman was no one he had ever known, merely a hobgoblin born of too little sleep and too much Jack Daniels. The previous night, still shaken by the news of his dad's death and dreading the trip to Asherville, he had dozed only fitfully. Now, because of weariness and whiskey, his dreams were bound to be populated with monsters. She was nothing more than the grotesque denizen of a nightmare. Nevertheless, the memory of that eyeless woman left him half crushed by an inexplicable sense of loss as heavy as the world itself. According to the radiant dial of his watch, it was 3:30 in the morning. He had been asleep less than 3 hours. Darkness still pressed against the window, and endless skeins of rain unraveled through the night. He got up from the bed and went to the corner desk where he had left the half-finished bottle of Jack Daniels. One more nip wouldn't hurt. He needed something to make it through to the dawn. As Joey uncapped the whiskey, he was gripped by a peculiar urge to go to the window. He felt drawn as if by magnetic force, but he resisted. Crazily, he was afraid that he might see the dead woman on the far side of the rain-washed glass, levitating one story above the ground, blonde hair tangled and wet, empty eye sockets darker than the night, in a transparent gown, arms extended, wordlessly imploring him to fling up the window and plunge into the storm with her. He became convinced that she was floating out there like a ghost. He dared not even glance toward the window or risk catching sight of it from the corner of his eye. If he saw her peripherally, even that minimal eye contact would be an invitation for her to come into his room. Like a vampire, she could tap at the window and plead to be let in, but she could not cross his threshold unless invited. Edging back to the bed with the bottle in his hand, he kept his face averted from that framed rectangle of night. He wondered if he was just unusually drunk or if he might be losing his mind. To his surprise, he screwed the cap back on the bottle without taking a drink. Chapter 3. In the morning, the rain stopped falling, but the sky remained low and threatening. Joey didn't have a hangover. He knew how to pace his drinking to minimize the painful results, and every day he took a megadose of vitamin B complex to replace what had been destroyed by alcohol. Extreme vitamin B deficiency was the primary cause of hangovers. He knew all the tricks. His drinking was methodical and well organized. He approached it as though it were his profession. He found the makings of breakfast in the kitchen, a piece of stale coffee cake, half a glass of orange juice. After showering, he put on his only suit, a white shirt and a dark red tie. He hadn't worn the suit in 5 years, and it hung loosely on him. The collar of the shirt was a size too large. He looked like a 15-year-old boy dressed in his father's clothes. Perhaps because the endless intake of booze accelerated his metabolism, Joey burned off all that he ate and drank, and invariably he closed each December a pound lighter than he'd begun the previous January. In another 160 years, he would finally waste away into thin air. At 10 o'clock, he went to the Devikowski funeral home on Main Street. It was closed, but he was admitted by Mr. Devikowski because he was expected. Louis Devikowski had been Asherville's mortician for 35 years. He was not sallow and thin and stoop-shouldered, as comic books and movies portrayed men of his trade, but stocky and ruddy-faced with dark hair untouched by gray, as though working with the dead was a prescription for long life and vitality. "Joey." "Mr. Devikowski." "I'm so sorry." "Me too." "Half the town came to the viewing last night." Joey said nothing. "Everyone loved your father." Joey didn't trust himself to speak. Devikowski said, "I'll take you to him." The front viewing room was a hushed space, with burgundy carpet, burgundy drapes, beige walls, and subdued lighting. Arrangements of roses loomed in the shadows, and the air was sweet with their scent. The casket was a handsome bronze model with polished copper trim and handles. By phone, Joey had instructed Mr. Devikowski to provide the best. That was how PJ would want it, and it would be his money paying for it. Joey approached the bier with the hesitancy of a man in a dream who expects to peer into the coffin and see himself. But it was Dan Shannon who rested in peace. In a dark blue suit on a bed of cream-colored satin. The past 20 years had not been kind to him. He looked beaten by time, shrunken by care, and glad to be gone. Mr. Devikowski had retreated from the room, leaving Joey alone with his dad. "I'm sorry," he whispered to his father. "Sorry I never came back. Never saw you or Mom again." Hesitantly, he touched the old man's pale cheek. It was cold and dry. He withdrew his hand, and now his whisper was shaky. "I just took the wrong road, a strange highway, and somehow there was never any coming back. I can't say why, Dad. I don't understand it myself." For a while he couldn't speak. The scent of roses seemed to grow heavier. Dan Shannon could have passed for a miner, though he had never worked the coal fields even as a boy. Broad, heavy features, big shoulders, strong, blunt-fingered hands cross-hatched with scars. He had been a car mechanic, a good one, although in a time and place that had never offered quite enough work. "You deserved a loving son," Joey said at last. "Good thing you had two, huh?" He closed his eyes. "I'm sorry. Jesus, I'm so sorry." His heart ached with remorse, as heavy as an iron anvil in his chest, but conversations with the dead couldn't provide absolution. Not even God could give him that now. When Joey left the viewing room, Mr. Devikowski met him in the front hall of the mortuary. "Does PJ know yet?" Joey shook his head. "I haven't been able to track him down." "How can you not be able to track him down? He's your brother," Devikowski said. For an instant before he regained the compassionate expression of a funeral director, his contempt was naked. "He travels all over, Mr. Devikowski. You know about that. He's always traveling, on the move, researching. It's not my fault, being out of touch with him." Reluctantly, Devikowski nodded. "I saw the piece about him in People a few months ago." P.J. Shannon was the quintessential writer of Life on the Road, the most famous literary gypsy since Jack Kerouac. "He should come home for a while," Davikowski said. "Maybe write another book about Asherville. I still think that was his best. When he hears about your dad, poor PJ, he's going to be broken up real bad. PJ really loved your dad." So did I, Joey thought, but he didn't say it. Given his actions over the past 20 years, he wouldn't be believed. But he had loved Ann Shannon. God, yes. And he'd loved his mother, Kathleen, whose funeral he had avoided and to whose deathbed he had never gone. "PJ visited just in August, stayed about a week. Your dad took him all over, showing him off. He was so proud, your dad." Davikowski's assistant, an intense young man in a dark suit, entered the far end of the hallway. He spoke in a practiced hush. "Sir, it's time to transport the deceased to Our Lady." Davikowski checked his watch. To Joey he said, "You going to the Mass?" "Yes, of course." The funeral director nodded and turned away, conveying by body language that this particular son of Dan Shannon had not earned the right to add "of course" to his answer. Outside, the sky looked burnt out, all black char and thick gray ashes, but it was heavy with rain. Joey hoped that the lull in the storm would last through the Mass and the graveside service. On the street, as he was approaching his parked car from behind, heading for the driver's door, the trunk popped open by itself, and the lid eased up a few inches. From the dark interior, a slender hand reached feebly toward him, as if in desperation, beseechingly. A woman's hand. The thumb was broken and hanging at a queer angle, and blood dripped from the torn fingernails. Around him, Asherville seemed to fall under a dark enchantment. The wind died. The clouds, which had been moving ceaselessly out of the northwest, were suddenly as unchanging as the vaulted ceiling of hell. All was lifeless. Silence reigned. Joey was frozen by shock and cold fear. Only the hand moved. Only the hand was alive. And only the hand's pathetic groping for salvation had any meaning or importance in a world turned to stone. Joey couldn't bear the sight of the dangling thumb, the torn nails, the slow drip of blood, but he felt powerfully compelled to stare. He knew that it was the woman in the transparent gown, come out of his dream from the night before into the waking world, though such a thing was not possible. Reaching out from the shadow of the trunk lid, the hand slowly turned palm up. In the center was a spot of blood and a puncture wound that might have been made by a nail. Strangely, when Joey closed his eyes against the sight of the horror before him, he could see the sanctuary of Our Lady of Sorrows as clearly as if he were standing upon the altar platform at that very moment. A silvery ringing of sacred bells broke the silence, but it was not a real sound in that October afternoon. They rang out of his memory from morning masses in the distant past. Through my fault, my most grievous fault. He saw the chalice gleaming with the reflections of candle flames. The wafer of the host was held high in the priest's hands. Joey strained hard to detect the moment of transubstantiation, the moment when hope was fulfilled, faith rewarded, the split instant of perfect mystery, wine into blood. Is there hope for the world for lost men like me? The images in his mind became as unbearable as the sight of the blood-smeared hand, and he opened his eyes. The hand was gone. The trunk lid was closed. The wind was blowing again, and the dark clouds rolled out of the northwest, and in the distance a dog barked. The trunk had never actually popped open, and the hand had never reached toward him. Hallucination. He raised his own hands and gazed at them, as though they were the hands of a stranger. They were trembling badly. Delirium tremens. The shakes. Visions of things crawling out of the walls, in this case out of a car trunk. All drunks had them from time to time, especially when they tried to give up the bottle. In the car again, he withdrew a flask from an inside pocket of his suit jacket. He stared at it for a long time. Finally, he unscrewed the cap, took a whiff of the whiskey, and brought it to his lips. Either he had stood half mesmerized by the car trunk far longer than he'd realized, or he had sat for an awfully long time with the flask, struggling against the urge to open it, because the funeral home hearse pulled out of the driveway and turned right, heading across town toward Our Lady of Sorrows. Enough time had passed for his father's casket to be transferred from the viewing room. Joey wanted to be sober for the funeral mass. He wanted that more than he had wanted anything in a long time. Without taking a drink, he screwed the cap back onto the flask and returned the flask to his pocket. He started the car, caught up with the hearse, and followed it to the church. More than once during the drive, he imagined that he heard something moving in the trunk of the car. A muffled thump, a tapping, a faint, cold, hollow cry. Chapter 4. Our Lady of Sorrows was as he remembered it. Dark wood lovingly polished to a satiny sheen. Stained glass windows waiting only for the appearance of the sun to paint bright images of compassion and salvation across the pews in the nave. Groin vaults receding into blue shadows above, the air woven through with a tapestry of odors, lemon oil furniture polish, incense, hot candle wax. Joey sat in the last pew, hoping that no one would recognize him. He had no friends in Asherville anymore. And without a long drink from his flask of whiskey, he wasn't prepared to endure the looks of scorn and disdain that he was sure to receive, and in fact that he deserved. More than 200 people attended the service, and to Joey the mood seemed even more somber than could be expected at a funeral. Dan Shannon had been well and widely liked, and he would be missed. Many of the women blotted their eyes with handkerchiefs, but the men were all dry-eyed. In Asherville, the men never wept publicly, and rarely in private. Although none had worked the mines in more than 20 years, they came from generations of miners who had lived in constant expectation of tragedy, of friends and loved ones lost to cave-ins and explosions and early-onset black lung disease. Theirs was a culture that not only valued stoicism, but could never have existed without it. Keep your feelings to yourself. Don't burden your friends and family with your own fear and anguish. Endure. That was the creed of Asherville, a guiding morality stronger even than that which was taught by the rector of Our Lady and the 2,000-year-old faith that he served. The Mass was the first that Joey had attended in 20 years. Evidently, at the insistence of the parishioners, it was a classic Mass in Latin, with the grace and eloquence that had been lost when the church had gone trendy back in the 60s. The beauty of the Mass did not affect him, did not warm him. By his own actions and desire over the past 20 years, he had placed himself outside the art of faith, and now he could relate to it only in the manner of a man who studied a fine painting through the window of a gallery, his perception hampered by distorting reflections in the glass. The Mass was beautiful, but it was a cold beauty, like that of winter light on polished steel, an Arctic vista. From the church, Joey drove to the cemetery. It was on a hill. The grass was still green, littered with crisp leaves that crunched under his shoes. His father was to be buried beside his mother. No name had yet been cut into the blank half of the dual-plot headstone. Being at his mother's graveside for the first time, seeing her name and the date of her passing carved in granite, Joey did not suddenly feel the reality of her death. The loss of her had been excruciatingly real to him for the past 16 years. In fact, he had lost her 20 years ago, when he had seen her for the last time. The hearse was parked in the road near the gravesite. Lou Devikowski and his assistant were organizing the pallbearers to unload the casket. The open grave awaiting Dan Shannon was encircled by a 3-foot-high black plastic curtain, not to provide a safety barrier, but to shield the more sensitive mourners from the sight of the raw earth in the sheer walls of the pit, which might force them into too stark a confrontation with the grim realities of the service that they were attending. The undertaker had also been discreet enough to cover the mound of excavated earth with black plastic and to drape the plastic with bouquets of flowers and bunches of cut ferns. In a mood to punish himself, Joey stepped to the yawning hole. He peered over the curtain to see exactly where his dad would be going. At the bottom of the grave, only half buried in loose earth, lay a body wrapped in blood-smeared plastic. A naked woman, face concealed, ribbons of wet blonde hair. Joey stepped back, bumping into other mourners. He was unable to breathe. His lungs seemed to be packed full of dirt from his father's grave. As solemn as a sepulchral sky, the pallbearers arrived with the casket and carefully deposited it onto a motorized sling over the excavation. Joey wanted to shout at them to move the casket and look below. Look at the tarp-wrapped woman. Look at the bottom of the pit. He couldn't speak. The priest had arrived, his black cassock and white surplice flapping in the wind. The interment service was about to begin. When the casket was lowered into that 7-foot-deep abyss atop the dead woman, when the grave was filled with earth, no one would ever know that she'd been there. To those in the world who loved her and sought her with such desperation, she would have vanished forever. Again, Joey tried to speak, but he was still unable to make a sound. He was shaking violently. On one level, he knew that the body at the bottom of the grave was not really there, a phantom, hallucination, delirium tremens, like the bugs that Ray Milland had seen crawling out of the walls in Lost Weekend. Nevertheless, a scream swelled in him. He would have given voice to it if he could have broken the iron band of silence that tightened around him, would have shouted at them, would have demanded that they move the casket and look into the hole, even though he knew that they would find nothing and that everyone would think him deranged. From the grave or from the mound beside it rose the fecund smell of damp earth and rotting vegetable matter, which called to mind all the small, teeming creatures that thrived below the sod, beetles, worms, and quick-moving things for which he had no name. Joey turned away from the grave, pushed through the 100 or more mourners who had come from the church to the cemetery, and stumbled down the hill through the ranks of tombstones. He took refuge in the rental car. Suddenly he was able to breathe in great gasps, and he found his voice at last. Oh God, oh God, oh God. He must be losing his mind. 20 years of all but constant inebriation had screwed up his brain beyond repair. Too many cells of gray matter had died in the long bath of alcohol. He was so far gone that only another taste of the same sin would give him surcease. He took the flask from his coat pocket. Aware that a month's worth of gossip was in the making, the startled mourners at the gravesite must have followed his stumbling flight with considerable interest. No doubt many, afraid of missing the next development, were still risking the disapproval of the priest by glancing downhill toward the rental car. Joey didn't care what anyone thought. He didn't care about anything anymore, except whiskey. But his dad still wasn't buried. He had promised himself that he would remain sober until the interment was complete. He had broken uncounted promises to himself over the years, but for reasons that he could not quite define, this one was more important than any of the others. He didn't open the flask. Uphill, under the half-bare limbs of the autumn-stripped trees, beneath a bruised sky, the casket slowly descended into the uncaring earth. Soon the mourners began to leave, glancing toward Joey's car with unconcealed interest. As the priest departed, several small whirlwinds full of dead leaves spun through the cemetery, exploding over headstones as if angry spirits had awakened from an uneasy rest. Thunder rolled across the heavens. It was the first peal in hours, and the remaining mourners hurried for their cars. The undertaker and his assistant removed the motorized casket lift and the black plastic skirt from around the open grave. As the storm resumed, a cemetery worker in a yellow rain slicker stripped the tarp and flowers from the mound of excavated dirt. Another worker appeared behind the wheel of a compact little earth-moving machine called a bobcat. It was painted the same shade of yellow as his raincoat. Before the open grave could be flooded by the storm, it was filled and then tamped down by the tread of the bobcat. "Goodbye," Joey said. He should have had a sense of completion, of having reached the end of an important phase of his life, but he only felt empty and incomplete. He had not put an end to anything, if that was what he had been hoping to do.